Here comes the spring. You guys can see what that is. It's spring steel, made to obviously a thickness and all. Now watch this. This is really cool. Ta-da! Oh, what's up, people? I am back because it's time to put some brakes on the Viper. Yeah, that's actually probably the first thing it needs. The original brakes on this car were not great. The front calipers are 4-piston, which we'll look at in a second, and the rear was just one big piston. Actually, I think the rear is a caliper that shares something off of a Lotus. Yeah, it sucks, especially for a big, high horsepower, slightly heavier car. Anyway, this is the brake rotor from the rear of the car. You can see that the Viper, of course, has the 6-lug pattern, which is fairly unique to it. Not a lot of cars do that. Now, this particular rotor is, of course, vented, which means it has these vents that go through the middle. It's also cross-drilled, hence the holes, and slotted, which are all good things for dissipating heat. However, keep in mind this is even though it's largely a tube frame car and handmade, it's still a production-based car. And rotors such as this are relatively inexpensive to manufacture. So there are some aspects that can be improved upon for racing, where the face here, or the actual rotor part, is a separate piece from the middle, which would be called a hap. This is a one-piece rotor. Then with regard to the front, and I'll just grab those, the fronts are a bit bigger. I will also remark that these rotors are in fact aftermarket. The original ones were not cross-drilled and all, they were vented. And the fronts you can see are a little wider, a little heftier than the rears, but still they're only so big. But the Dodge Viper originally had 17-inch wheels, both front and rear. And in doing so, you can only put so large of a rotor in it, and they worked relatively well. However, you don't get enough ventilation to them to keep them cool in a road racing sort of environment, even though generally it works well. And also the brake bias is really not great. It's far too much braking effort to the front, where you'll lock up the front wheels far before you ever do the rear. And with a car without ABS, you're not getting the maximum out of it. But worse than that is when it heats up to that point where they fade because you don't have enough cooling, depending on the pads you have and the brake fluid and such, you can boil that over or make it so you get brake fade, and you are not going to stop. Which, with regard to this car, I discovered would happen within only a couple of laps, even just driven on street tires on a road racing circuit. So I was pretty happy here. We're going to take a real close look, but PFC brakes I've gotten with, and we are going to do a custom set for this Viper. So I'm actually getting to prototype that with them, and I'm going to show you here right now the brakes. So here is the original sized front brake that would go on the Viper. And then here in this wheel will be the size of brake from PFC that will go on it. A little bit larger, obviously. You can see the width here, bigger, it's vented. Now these are not cross-drilled because they found that the holes will basically create a place for it to crack. But what's most interesting, and we're gonna look at this real carefully together, about proper racing brakes is the center hat here is actually aluminum, whereas the outer part is steel. Now these brakes here are every bit as high a quality and in many ways better than what is on some modern era Indy cars and such, really. So it's pretty incredible. This rotor is also slightly larger in diameter than the newest, the Gen 5 Dodge Viper ACR. So they are every bit of amount of rotor that you can squeeze in this car. Now, my Dodge Viper no longer has the 17-inch wheels on it. It's got 18-inch in the front and 19-inch in the rear of the same configuration as the Gen 5 Dodge Vipers are now. So this is why I'm able to get away with a larger rotor and thicker. Now the calipers haven't come yet, but let's get to this thing called the hat, which is aluminum. Of course it makes a lighter weight, but being two-piece, as the heat goes into this steel rotor here, it allows it to expand and such, but not flex. We'll keep it truer. But the other thing you'll notice is, listen, you can hear that there's just a minute amount of play. So these are in fact a full floating rotor. There are rotors that are said to be full floating on street and performance cars and exotic cars, but they're so tight that they're not really. But these, we decided to go the extra bit and let them basically be what people at JEGS hate it when customers come in and saying full race. So what that basically means is that they weren't concerned about making it be quiet, so at slow speeds, when things are quiet, if I'm cruising through the pits or driving on cobblestone street, you might actually hear your rotors rattle a little, clickety, clickety, clickety. But that's because they were built to have the maximum positive effect in the environment of racing. So let's dive in here deep and check it out. And then we're gonna see how fitment's gonna be on the car, what I've gotta modify to make this work before the calipers come. But what I'm gonna do is show you how simple it is to remove the actual rotor from the hat. Now, it has a very interesting spring type clip in it. So now what I'm gonna try to do is move this over a little bit, and I hope that the angle will show you guys well. Also don't want to screw up the hood of my car, even though it makes a great tool bench now and then. I'm literally just going to use my Swiss Army knife here, and let's find the end of this spring clip. Let's see if I can do it with this. I haven't actually done this, I just think I'm cool. I did stay at a Holiday Inn Express last night. No, I did not. Okay, here we go. Here comes the spring. You guys can see what that is. It's spring steel, made to obviously a thickness and all. Now watch this, this is really cool. Ta-da! Look at that. There is the steel rotor. That's their patented technology with these nicely machined tabs on it. So in the future, if I'm driving or racing and the actual rotor gets worn out, I simply replace the steel part here, and this nicely machined hat remains for the Viper. You can see there where each one of those feet or tines go into place. And they machine them, the tolerances just a little differently for it to truly be full floating for a race, or if it's gonna be just a touch tighter for the street, for people that would hate to hear that little tickety over bumps. And then of course it comes with an extra spring clip in this. Now, these rotors here are the fronts, which are in the larger box here, and then the rears for the Dodge Viper are there. Now they're darn near the exact same diameter. They look much the same. They're a little narrower. They don't have to do quite as much work, and they have a slightly different offset. Now, one big thing you'll all notice is this has 5 holes. Well, technically a 6th one. That would be for a little screw to hold it in place. Now, PFC does not yet make a kit for Dodge Vipers, and all Dodge Vipers do have the 6 bolt hole pattern here, hence why later wheels can bolt on an earlier car. Not quite vice versa, because they may not fit over the brakes if you put old wheels on a new car, and why would you do that anyway? But what I'm going to do is I'm going to utilize these, and I'm going to have to take this to a machinist friend of mine. And with PFC, we did all the measurements and such and made sure it was right. And then for this is really a prototyping experiment. But I will be able to utilize this and put the pattern over here and where it is in terms of its center line, exact radius and diameter, you know, where the holes will hit, and drill this precisely, as well as just a few millimeters out on the radius of the inner diameter of this hole, and that's going to make it fit on the Dodge Viper. So once that happens, it'll slide right over the drive flange and the lugs, and then you'll be able to put the wheel on, of course, with the rotor. So I'm going to go ahead and show you guys what it's like to put the rotor right back on here, and how simple that is. Come on, yay. Hopefully this won't be like a bad episode of Antiques Roadshow where I break everything. Okay, so first I'm gonna just gently spread that, not enough to bend it. I don't wanna kink it or bend it or anything like that. Just gotta get it started here. So I'm gonna use one hand to hold it, and then the other hand I'm just gonna kind of work it in like this. This is in a spiral, go roundy round, and doot. Ta-da, look at that. And that's it. It's in place, ready to go. So obviously when I take this to machine shop, I've already done all of my engineering drawings and measurements of this car using a nice set of calipers. In fact, I'll show you that to you guys. Got some new ones. And I typically like calipers. You want a high quality one, but for me, I'm a bit old school and I like ones with a dial. In no small part because I'll go long stints with having to use calipers and the batteries always die, which drives me bonkers. Plus it's easy to watch something mechanical and know that it's working properly or not. Of course they have some limitations, but for me they really get the job done, and it'll last for generations, so that's always a nice thing there too. But anyway, we'll be taking that to the machine shop, and when I do that I'm just going to take them the hats and write out specifically what it needs to be. So when it's time to drill out the 6 bolt hole pattern on this, they will know what the diameter or radius is from center line, well diameter of course is across, but if it's radius, from center line to the center of what the bolt suite circle is. Of course it's 6 bolts, and then they will be spaced evenly, and then what the ID of the hole needs to be. So it's real simple. And I will also bring them the original rotors just so the machine shop can't make a mistake. Not to say that a machine shop would make a mistake, but let's be honest, we all make mistakes. So let's go on to the next thing here quickly. I'll show you the pads. Now, carbon metallic pads are interesting. PFC has been known for this forever, and they've done a really great job. They have numerous compounds, and one thing that's really cool about the compounds, unless I'm mistaken, and I don't think that I am, they are compatible with all of their compounds. So I can have a set of brake pads. I'm gonna set these right here. These are the fronts, and these would be the rears. Of course, this is the stock rotor, mind you, from the front of the car. But I'm just going to give you an example and show you the different sizes of pads until the calipers come. So this is a front pad, which will be used on a 6-piston monoblock caliper. Very, very cool. In fact, PFC makes calipers and brakes for Porsche GT3 cars that you see racing all around the world, as well as IndyCar. They are the supplier, if I'm not mistaken, of all IndyCar brakes currently. But this is a front pad and this is a rear pad. Why is this one smaller? Well, you do less braking effort with the rear. You have more weight distribution to the front when you're braking on a car. So naturally, your rear brakes do a bit less work. So that's why their size is such. It's also rather nice because in those calipers, you can see there's a lot of meat there to wear. So they're gonna last quite a long time. And that's what's exciting, but also because they're compatible across their range of different pads that have different coefficients of friction and heat ranges, they will very quickly, shall we say, bed or scrub and be ready to go. Whereas if you switch, maybe if you switch from one type or from another brand or something over to others, there's a whole period of getting them work. But this is something that works really nice when you stay within their family and technology. So I was really happy with that and just super excited. But obviously really honored that they're working with me and that we get a prototype something for this Viper. So that's the scoop there. Now I'm looking forward for the calipers to come. And with regard to that, let's see, yep, these go here. They're the small ones. But anyway, I'm looking forward for the calipers to come. They're gonna really be just shining jewels. And you know, I think a lot of us sports car people take things like that for granted. You know, we see a big brake rotor and we think more pistons, bigger, better. And if it's painted red or yellow, that's great, yay. Well, no, not all calipers are created equal. And many calipers from even very high performance street cars are still built for production basis where there's compromises that have to be made. For instance, they may be two-piece, or maybe the pads have to be able to be removed without taking the caliper off, and things like that that make it easier, but potentially make the caliper more flexible and weaker. So if you've got your brake rotor here, and you've got a caliper here, and when you push your brake pedal, you're making hydraulic pressure go through the lines and act into the pistons of your brake caliper. And that's where all the braking force comes from, of course. But as the pistons come outward like that and apply the force to the pad, your brake caliper, which is around here, which is the body that holds the pistons and is the cylinders and pushes the pads, it will flex. Now that's something that is a huge enemy of braking for all cars, and especially you see with lesser brands or especially with production-based cars, is flexing of the caliper. Many of you that worked your own brakes can see it, whereas when you're bleeding your brakes, if you're down there at the caliper and you have a buddy in the car pushing the brake pedal hard, you can actually see things flexing. And when they flex, a number of things are happening. One, you're using energy to flex the caliper and not put pressure directly into your rotor and your braking surface. But also, as it flexes, it changes angles, and you're going to have uneven pressure of your brake pad. So by having a superior designed, especially like a monoblock caliper from PFC, you're going to be able to apply a far larger amount of that force directly into braking and having it have less deflection or flexing. Now I say less and far more rather than none or all, because it's impossible to get rid of all flex. But when you get rid of virtually all of it and you're head over heels above your competition, that's where you're going to be really successful. Okay guys, so in looking at this, and if you're thinking of putting on different rotors and of course calipers, maybe a kit to your car, certainly look into that. They're not all created equal and you never know what's going on. But I think all of us hot rodders and custom builders and tinkerers, you know, want to make things better. So in this circumstance, I'm just really going all in and making something great. So to show you guys, there's a number of things that have to happen. One, you can see how dirty this is after the better part of 100,000 miles. But with the calipers, measurements that are very important are, one, the diameter of this flange. That relates to how the brake rotor fits over it. You guys remember the hole the big hole in the middle of the hat, that big hole right in the middle. Obviously, I have to get the clearance exactly right so it fits over it perfectly, effectively with no slop, because it'll be imperative that the brake rotor is centered so when it's spinning it's not out of balance. And of course we're going to have the tightest clearance as possible with the caliper fitting over that. Naturally, it would be a disaster to get it off center. And we're talking tiny amounts. So really not going to be the hardest thing in the world, but doable. Obviously it has to be drilled properly for all 6. Now, some of you may say, hey Casey, that'll really compromise this by drilling 6. Well, depending on how you place it in there, to be honest, it's really not going to matter that much. But I'm saying that off the record. This is for the sake of prototyping and me as the test guinea pig. Although I think it's going to go very well from experience. So obviously in the future, if they do this, it'll be spot on and perfect. But going further than that, I wanted to exemplify some of the measurements you're looking at when you're actually going to build different braking system or hang on larger calipers and such. So this is the stock caliper here. They are 4-piston aluminum bodied calipers with the pads in there. Now let me see if I can get this off here. One moment. Got it finger tight. Here we go. Oh, it's attached by a zip tie. That's annoying. Well, I think you guys can see here that the stock pads kind of jammed in there. There's obviously a lot of brake dust and things over the years. And you can see the crossover here with the external line. And why that exists is you've got your line here, brake line, feeding the fluid into this side of the caliper, which goes to both pistons here. But then, of course, you need this external line, hard line here, to take the pressure from that side and get it over to here where the other pistons are. Now you'll also notice that there is a brake bleeder here and here, which when it's mounted is on the top where the air will arise to on both sides. Some of the downsides of this, of course, is this is a 2-piece caliper. It is bolted together. There's a bolt here, 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 and here. Now, that will inherently create places for flex to happen, which we spoke about, which will just counteract your efficient braking and all the effort you're putting in with the hydraulic pressure into the pads and into the rotor. Also, having the outside line is another place where it could be a failure, and also micro flexing of that line will also make it inefficient with the hydraulic pressure going into it. So having the PFC calipers that are on their way, I can't wait to show you guys, they're monoblock, doesn't have the external lines, and you're not going to get the flex from there. The other thing about it is this caliper is totally open, so the pads can be slipped out. I guess they do that for the sake of the street. But with PFC braking calipers, you simply take the 2 bolts off to remove the caliper and then pull the pads out that way. The reason being is they're able to create structure over top of where the pads are, which makes it far stiffer. That really doesn't change much in terms of longevity and serviceability. In some ways it's easier actually, but it makes such a huge improvement for the braking, it's very much worth it. And also, if you recall a moment ago when I showed you the thickness of the pads, they're quite thick pads, so that's really nice how that works. But with regard to measurements that have to happen, obviously with a rotor now that's a bit bigger than the original, and depending on its offset, you can see the offset here when it goes on there, the original mounting ears on the spindle or the upright, depending on how you call it, and that's this piece of aluminum chunk here that the suspension attaches to and the bearings are all in. This is the main meat, this whole assembly here. But the caliper bolts to it. So I will have to design, after much measuring and thinking, a billet aluminum piece that will bolt to the original ears and perhaps also pick up the bolts here of the bearing cassette to then put in the proper space and place where the new caliper will go, and that's how that'll be done. But the first step is, of course, for prototyping, for me to drill the hats and get them on and get the rotors on. But I'm really excited about that, and you guys can see, I mean, how cool is this? This is superior to what was on the Gen 5 Dodge Viper. So even though Old Goose here is from the 90s and is a second generation GTS variant, it's going to have brakes that are absolutely second to none. And then lastly, let's have a look here at the wheel and just what the fitment looks like. This is an interesting piece of paper I cut out, and I put it on a flexible ruler here to see what's going on. Now, if you forgive me, I'm going to grab the cutout piece of paper here. I laid it on the Omega car. Oh, come here. And so part of this is when you get engineering drawings, obviously done in the CAD program with them, You know, I can see the size and dimensions of the rotors and such for prototyping, but they also made this, which I cut out precisely and made sure it was scaled properly on the printer, which gave me this. Now what this is a cross-sectional representation of effectively half of the rotor and the caliper. Now, the best way you can see this is we're trying to check wheel clearance here. And if I show you on the wheel, let's see if we can imagine this together. I feel like this is kind of like Mr. Rogers' moment, isn't it? So the caliper is going to be up in here, right? It's going to be this big block like where my fist is. Well, the spokes are here and the rim of the wheel is there. So we need to make sure that you can measure all those things, but spatial reasoning and being able to see something makes it much easier. So I'm going to show you. This bump here fits into the center of the wheel, okay? And then as this goes out, as it will go in the wheel, this represents the cross-sectional aspect of the outside of the caliper and the very top, or the outside as it goes to the rim. And by outside of the caliper, I mean the outside that's visible from outside the car through the spokes. So this, if this collides with the spokes or if this collides with the wheel or it's too close, that would be a problem. So I'm gonna see if we can see this. Basically what this does is it goes right in here, just like that. Now, this is going to be a very tight fit, in all honesty. We are pushing the ragged edge on this, and we're within millimeters, just a few millimeters. So I want to really get this going again. I put a lot of time in the other day to making sure I had this spot on, but we're within 3 or 4 millimeters of clearance right here of the caliper to the wheel rim. Now we got quite a lot, got a good centimeter at the closest place here to the spokes. And I'll even try to, can Casey get the wheel up to see? Casey, you should choose different words. Okay, let's see, can you guys see? The lighting is bad. How are we doing? Oh, we're doing badly, we're doing so badly. Let me just shove this in here. Shove it in. Okay, here we go. I hope you guys can see that. Can you see that right there underneath my watch? Very close. Now another note is I'm going to have to be mindful about where lead tape is placed on this, because just the lead tape is close enough that any flex and it's going to get nicked by the caliper as the wheel spins and take it right off. But we're super close. It's going to work. And there is some, I hate to use the word cheating, but I can, there's some things I can do to gain like a 0.5 millimeter or millimeter clearance here and there to make sure everything's going to be right. Obviously that comes into place with the quality of a number of things. How much flexing might exist within your wheel, how much flexing may exist with regard to your bearing cassette and such, the placement of the caliper in regard to where it's clocked on the whole assembly, and those come into play. Obviously now we're going to run these Hoosier racing slicks, which are quite nice. And sadly, the tires are much newer and shinier than my wheels. These have got to be cleaned up, but they do have some age on them, and I'm going to have to polish them up because the nature of all the braking over the years has been unkind to the white finish of these wheels. But that's what's going on, guys. I wanted to show you that and just do a bit of a talking video because when you're designing and engineering, it takes a lot of time behind the scenes. And I've spent a number of days just printing things out, communicating with PFC, coming down to the shop, measuring things. And I really appreciate them putting in the time. I really like the company and the people there. And that's really what it's going to take for me to be able to build my dream Viper, and something I can still drive on the street that'll perform incredibly, but also that I can take to the track and have no issues. And one of the biggest issues, of course, with the brakes, they simply were not adequate at all for the track. And then, of course, the other thing that was completely inadequate were the cooling. Those were the two biggest things. Now, I look forward to show you what's being made right now with regard to the radiator and oil cooler. That's coming up soon. But today was the first step in getting the brakes. Showing you guys the calipers and the pads. Gonna get those machined. Excuse me, showing you the rotors and the pads. Gonna get the hats machined so they can be bolted up. Then, when the calipers come, I'll be able to be doing the measurement and doing the designs for the caliper mounts. And there's even going to have to be some modifications to the rear uprights or spindles of the Viper to do it. But I'm hugely excited because these brakes are the nicest brakes of any car I've ever had. And that includes all the race cars too. It's going to be pretty cool. So look forward to see you guys next time.